And with that, you're on.
Thank you. My name is Kamara Sika. I'm the Vice President of Programs at YW Boston, where we work to eliminate racism and empower women and promote peace, justice, and dignity for all. And so a big part of our work is really focusing on that eliminating racism and empowering women, specifically thinking about how we can be a thought leader in the issues of intersection of race and gender that helps individuals and institutions be more inclusive environments where women, people of color, and particularly women of color can succeed. And so the topic that we're actually talking about tonight is the criminalization of youth. And the reason why YW Boston finds this work to be really important is that the girls, I'm going ahead of my schedule, girls in particular, girls of color, really are experiencing challenges with the school to prison pipeline and the issues that come up for them in discipline within the schools. So the work that we do in our advocacy program, all the work that we do around legislation, we follow two different policies. The biggest one that we focus on right now is this school to prison pipeline, focusing on girls. We have a girls leadership program that does some of this advocacy work. It'll be rolling out this fall, so it works with within their schools, thinking specifically about the challenges that they are experiencing and how they can help to raise awareness and advocate for themselves around the challenges that they are facing that have to do with the school to prison pipeline. So some of the issues, just to really think about the challenges with the school to prison pipeline for girls of color, is that they are being challenged in a way because of what the environments have in the school. So when you think about disciplinary issues, specifically around clothing, hair, all of those issues, girls of color are really the targets for a lot of these issues. They end up being suspended more often. There's a larger achievement gap because of these issues. There's assault that happens within the schools because of some of these challenges. They are often being pulled by their families to engage in other work outside of focusing on schools. And so recognizing that there are some disparities that occur, particularly for girls of color in Boston. So the numbers, just when we look at Boston itself, is that there's broken down both by race and gender. 41% Hispanic, or I would prefer to say Latinx folks. The 28% of girls are black, 15% of girls are white. And this is the girls in Boston Public Schools, so thinking specifically about the BPS system. And when you look at how these girls are disciplined, 61% of those black girls are being, 61% of girls total are being disciplined that are black. Does that make sense? So if you can see that black and Hispanic girls are disciplined disproportionately, even compared to their male counterparts. So you see that black boys are being disciplined 57% of the time. And so often the story is told and we think about the justice system. When you hear about the justice system, often we think of men or boys. And so I'd just like for us to begin to think a little bit about the fact that there's this hidden demographic of girls that are really experiencing the justice system in a way that is a little bit hard to wrap our heads around and try to unpack that system. There are a couple of solutions, and so the work that we have been doing at YW Boston is supporting legislation for changing school discipline. That law actually passed in 2018. The challenge that we are facing now is that the schools are not instituting this law. So I can go back. I feel like my slides are gonna go a little zany. But the act to create criminal justice reform specifically for juveniles has been passed. Schools are not actually implementing them. And so it is now the work to really that change. So that's just a general overview of why YW really finds this work to be valuable. This is not even a tip of that iceberg, but my colleague, Dr. Mays Rothstein, is going to come up and give us actually some really great information about how youth of color are really being criminalized and what is happening for them and how we can work to make that change.
Good evening. I'm Susan Mays Rothstein, and I would like to talk with you a little bit about the Cradle to Prison pipeline. We just referred to it as the school to prison pipeline. Just here to say that I think that's a bit of a misnomer. I think that actually what we need to be talking about, should be talking about, is the cradle to prison pipeline, because that's actually when all of these challenges begin. I will be brief because I'd like to get us to our panel and have as much discussion as possible. And also I want to leave a little time for question and answer. I teach here at Northeastern University School of Law, and I have been responsible for a social justice program that is required for the first year of study at Northeastern Law. And I've been responsible for that for 20 of my 22 years. So, I also teach a class called, in case you want to join the law school, called Disrupt the Cradle to Prison Pipeline, Restorative Justice. So, I just want you to take a quick look at this image. Imagine this child being printed. Probably thinks this is a game. He probably thinks this is a game. He's of the age where putting his fingers on some ink and putting them somewhere else would probably feel more like a game than an actual life and career altering event. I want to linger for just a moment on this particular slide. It is a bit dated, but unfortunately the figures that are on it are much less dated than one would hope. On the left-hand side, is that, yeah? Yes, that's still the left-hand side. I didn't know what it. On the left-hand side, you see what happens from school to prison. On the right-hand side, you see the foster care to prison aspects of the pipeline. So foster care, of course, starts at any child's age and often is referred to as our child welfare system. Another misnomer, I would suggest. Because if you look at the figures on the right-hand side, you'll note that the percentage of children in the foster care system that are Black or Latino or Latinx is 50%. Meanwhile, after you look at what happens at the juvenile justice system level, the incarceration system level, unemployment level, 70%, and this is a California figure, 70% of the young people who have been in foster care in their life end up in state prison. But here in Massachusetts, we have actually done better than that. 72% of our children who have been in touch with the so-called child welfare system are actually ending up in our prisons. So that's a pretty impressive figure. If you think about it in terms of, say, nonprofits looking for funding. Imagine a nonprofit coming to you as a funder and saying, hey, I've got a great program. 70% of the children I touch will end up in prison. Will you give me money? exactly. I see the laughter, you know. And in fact, that is what we do for our child welfare system every single year. We fund them despite the fact that 72% of the children that they touch will end up in prison. No one says, hey, you need to be evidence-based. You can't get any more state funds unless you're able to demonstrate that your foster care and your child welfare system actually advances people's lives. So that's part of my argument for why we need to think in terms of the cradle to prison pipeline and not the school to prison pipeline. Over on the left-hand side, the figures do not improve, because if you start out at that level of disadvantage, chances are when you're in school, your expectation of being expelled from school in some way, that is excluded from school through suspensions or expulsions, is actually extremely high. And from there, the figures get worse until you note that almost 70% of the male inmates in state prisons do not have a high school diploma. So, a little bit more on this. This is actually the true starting point of the cradle to prison pipeline. It is poverty. In fact, our child welfare system is more about poverty control than it is about child welfare. And it's poverty control because it is invasive in the lives of people who are poor. And making decisions about what happens with their children. So that is our actual starting point. It is then coupled with inadequate ability to have health care. This child, Devontae Johnson, as you can see, lived 14 years of his life, 1993 to 2007. Devontae was a child who was struggling with kidney cancer. He went without health care coverage for 4 months in 2006 while his mother attempted to renew his Medicare coverage. On March 1, 2007, he succumbed to his cancer because of lack of medical care. In the United States of America, one of the richest nations in the world, how is it possible that these are the kinds of outcomes? Then there's disparate educational opportunities, which we were just hearing about in the context of young black and brown women, girls, if they're younger. But the disparate educational opportunities, not to mention, once arriving at anything that could be considered a semblance of an opportunity, being pushed out of school with school exclusions. If you're coming from a background where your life has been set up in such a way that you're beset by government interventions, you don't have adequate health care, you are not able to get into school and sit quietly and pay attention, which then becomes the beginning place for the school exclusion. So here this is where, folks, the plot thickens and we compound the harm. So Massachusetts, of course, in 2014, we just heard about crime reform and bill that passed in 2014, we had a school discipline law change called Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 222. And the reason that Massachusetts was not measuring up and needed a school discipline law was that 60% of our out-of-school suspensions were for non-violent, non-criminal, non-drug-related behavior. Let me repeat that. For non-violent, non-criminal, non-drug-related behavior. The greatest racial disparities were showing up in suspensions for minor offenses. The rates of school discipline for the differential colors of our students: 1 in 27 white students, 1 in 10 Latinx students, and 1 in 8 black students. This is Massachusetts, and our disparities got to almost double the national average. That's right, I heard you. So progressive. Got that point taken. So let's just look at for a second what is the impact of the loss of instruction, also known as education deprivation. A 3-day absence predicts a 1 lower grade level in reading. 3 times an increase in the risk of dropping out in the state of Texas, and controlling for other factors. A lower graduation rate by between 6 and 14 points for Florida, California, and nationally. Suspension from school, exclusion from school is the leading indicator in future incarceration. So, taking this from another perspective, in terms of loss of instructional time from school per 100 students enrolled. And this is 2015 to 2016. As you can see, the winners in the loss of instructional time are black students at 28 days of loss, students with disabilities at 34 days of lost instructional time. White students with 4.5, Latinx students with 16.1. And in our prior presentation, you saw the percentages of the population that the students represent. So then let's look at the charter, non-charter school picture. The difference between the blue column, which is the charter average, and the red column, which is the non-charter average, is the orange column, which is the difference between the two. So for all students, you see that the charter schools average is twice the non-charter average, with a difference of 46. For black students, 110 to 81, not a big difference, but still a difference, with a difference of 95 students. And then finally, students with disabilities.
Excuse me,
The charter schools.
Highest rates of what?
What's that?
I don't know what its highest rates are.
What the highest rates are?
It's the highest rates of something in Boston.
Oh, the highest rates in Boston between charter and non-charter schools for
What?
Rate of what?
school exclusions we're talking about right
Okay.
now. Yeah. School exclusions.
Is this days lost?
What's that?
Is this days lost?
Days lost.
Yes, days lost from school. So friends, that's what the story is. And what we've attempted to do is really just to get a start on your thinking about the cradle to prison pipeline. And I think what we want to do is to find out from you, and for you to find out from one another, what it is that you'd like to know in addition to what we're talking about here. So as a basic discussion question, based on what you've just heard, what surprised you? What would you like to learn more about? So if you could take a minute to essentially pair and share, that is the person next to you. If you could say something to one another about what you were surprised about and what you had, some of you may not be surprised about anything, but what you were surprised about and what you might want to learn more about. Good people. All right, folks, what drew energy in your conversation? This is quick. Do we need to be bringing microphones around to people?
No, people can just.
People can hear? Okay. Yes.
Hi, Martin was asking, this is Martin, everybody. And we were wondering, what interventions work and at what stage in this pattern.
Well, that is something that Northeastern University School of Law is working with the Boston Bar Association to begin to actually answer that question in some detail. So we can talk about that a little bit further when we're sitting together on the panel. But currently we're trying to map, we're starting a project to map the cradle to prison pipeline here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And on the mapping front, we would like to identify both the things that are contributing greatly to the cradle to the prison pipeline from the cradle level. Bear in mind that schools do self-identify at this point as members of the school to prison pipeline because we've said it so much, but housing, unemployment, poor health care, which we'll talk to you ad nauseum about social indicators of health, do not self-identify as contributors to the Cradle to Prison pipeline. So we can't just go ask healthcare people, so what is it that you're doing to improve your situation here about contributing to the Cradle to Prison? They don't even see that, so it's like, what are you talking about? So we're starting to do a mapping project to answer your question, Martin, and we'll be back to you in about several years. But, yes.
Yes. Why the foster care system has been so negligible for so many years and there was no intervention to improve it?
So
and if
there
is any, or is anything in the plan?
So yes, so the question is regarding the foster care system and why has it been so negligent in the past and why hasn't there been anything to improve it? The politicians would tell you that there have been many attempts to improve it, and here's the way it works. The foster care system pedals along quietly, and children die. So then when the children die, everybody, the Globe carries an article, children are dying in the foster care, and then the politicians look at it, they do an audit, they do a study, and they say, oh, we've got to do more taking children away from families. And then they go about the business, and they fund that, and then things get quiet, and the foster care system pedals along, and then children die, and then the Globe covers an article, they say, oh, we need to do an audit. They do an audit, and they say, oh, we need to reunite more families. So, and that is a problem. That's a problem because what happens is we fall asleep in between the times the children are not dying in ways that can make it to the Boston Globe. And there's something fundamentally challenging and wrong with that because what we're talking about is a professional drop-in system. The professional system is, in our social services, is that we drop in, we get highly educated, we drop into people's lives, we do something good, hopefully, while we're there, or maybe not, and then we leave. And we are there so long as we are paid, and we are not there when we are not paid. And there is something fundamentally wrong with that. That is our system, that is all of our programming, that is how we do things. It doesn't create a community of care. So I'm going to go up, and then I'll come back down. Okay, up.
We had questions on two of the slides. I was wondering if you could put up the slide that was a 2x2 matrix that talked about.
You want me to put a slide back up?
Good, yeah.
Okay. That's another slideshow.
Nope, it's the same one, just scroll all the way down.
Let's go all the way down.
Yeah. Put them together.
Okay, this one?
No, I think it's three.
Down farther?
No, four, earlier.
Earlier.
This one right here. You got your matrix. No.
Nope.
Right. No. As I read this, we didn't understand it. It looked to me like you were saying that of the people who are disciplined, this is the right hand side, of the people who are disciplined, here's how it breaks down.
Okay.
What others in this group thought it was that that's the.
This one?
No, the one you're on.
No, the one that you're on,
The very last.
he's talking the one, he's asking the question.
The grids.
You were on the slide.
Oh, no.
Up.
No. That's perfect, sir. The one that you see before. Yes.
Okay, that's not my
of the girls are disciplined, and the bottom right is 87% of the guys are disciplined. It doesn't show.
Yes, so it is actually the percentage of students disciplined. So of all the students disciplined, 60 of the girls, 61% of all girls disciplined are black girls.
So maybe only 2% of the girls are disciplined, but 60% of those 2% are black.
So of the total number of decisions.
Yes,
Yes.
Except
and so I do not have the data on me right now, but it is, you can.
You can.
You can't compare the numbers of boys and girls, because they could be very different ways. If the girls are disciplined at X rate, and the boys are disciplined at 2X rate, or vice versa, then.
Well, that's, if we were talking concrete numbers, yes, but if we're talking percentages, that's why it's presented in a percentage and not the actual numbers.
Relative to other girls,
Cor-
the black young women and girls are disciplined at a much higher rate, and then the next one down is relative to the
Correct.
total boys disciplined, the black young men and boys are disciplined at that higher rate.
That is correct.
How it goes.
And the other slide we had a question on was the one with all the words on it.
Sorry. My lots of information thrown at you because I only had a couple of minutes.
No, it's the one,
Not this one?
The one with the chart with on the two sides.
The one up top?
Correct.
No, down. Oh, down.
This
I
one?
think it's probably this.
No.
This one?
No, one more. Keep going up.
Up? This
Oh,
one.
that one.
Yes.
Yeah, so the question we had on it is the percentage of foster care in the prison system. Are you saying that 75% of the people who have been in foster care in Massachusetts will accept having their life go to prison? Or are you saying that of all the people in prison, 75% of them have been in foster care?
So of the inmates in prison at the time this particular slide was created in the state of California, 70% of those inmates in California in the state prison were former foster care children. 70% of all the inmates in prison.
Right, so it's not 70% of all foster care people end up in prison.
Yeah. Yeah.
Still,
Is this the mathematical corner of the?
data. It's like prison room with the data.
The data corner. Okay. Is there another?
Children, all children of color in the 70s. Is this just foster care in prison, or is this
This is not,
minority foster care children?
yeah, this is foster care children. So poor children, mostly black and brown children. And, because the population that is most affected by foster care are black and brown children.
Okay.
The children who go to foster care, what percentage of them end up in prison? That's
Of the
more-
children who go to foster care, what percentage of them end up in prison?
That's more important and substantive question.
Okay. Of the children who are in foster care system there, 50% are brown and black. Of the foster care children, in the juvenile justice system, 30% of them are there for behavioral reasons. And 25% of young people who leave foster care will be incarcerated within a few years after the age of 18. And 50% of those young people leaving foster care will be unemployed within a few years after the age of 18.
So,
That's what I have as figures.
so this indicates that foster care is beneficial for them.
So where is the benefit coming from?
The
Precisely.
benefit is if they leave, they go to end up with no education and engage in activities that leads them to prison. If they stay to foster care, they get the benefit of having support and guidance to do better in life.
Oh, if they stayed in foster care. Most children that are in foster care are in multiple households in a very short period of time. And there's absolutely no way that a child can be thought to be doing better when you're being shifted from household to household to household. I understand your point, but I don't, I understand your point, but I don't know that it's made by the stay in the foster care system idea.
Are we currently supporting an alternative pilot program of intervention for students and kids and babies?
A private program. So
Some kind of alternative. We've got all of this that doesn't seem to be functioning really well, which is an understatement. But is there something else in the making of an alternative intervention support?
So this is a challenge. So there are many programs, all 501c3s and others, non-governmental organizations, 501c3s. What is the problem is that the efforts are atomized. And what happens when the efforts are atomized is that you are all involved in the mad dash, what I call the mad dash for cash. And when you're involved in the mad dash for cash, you have to say that your effort is in fact the best thing since sliced bread. And then they will give you a crumb of money, ask you to make sure that it is evidence-based, what you're doing, and then you'll be back on that treadmill in the mad dash for cash. So the effectiveness of private programs is inhibited by the atomization that actually is our private program funding system. Now, I promised this group over here quite some time ago.
Yeah, so I wanted to know about one of the slides when we were talking, I was talking with my classmate Emma, and we were discussing the slide that had, I think it was the 1 in 27 white kids go to get suspended or lose time in school, and it was 1 in 10 and 1 in 8. What is this based off of? Is it controlled by poverty, or is it race, or is it a mixture of both?
That would have to be a both and right there. Right? So poverty, unfortunately, is one of the issues that race, black and brown people face most starkly. When you have the mixture of the two, that's the outcome you're going to be getting. Because again, why we need to start with pervasive poverty as one of the keystone issues in the Cradle to Prison pipeline. Thank you very much for this exercise, folks.
Yeah, so follow-up question to that. Sorry, so why are we looking at, so that makes a lot of sense, but my question is, why are we looking at this in terms of like this graph just shows, I mean, my glasses aren't very good, that it says, like, just black students. Why isn't there a matrix or something to show black students, white students, Latinos, Latinx students, and then a matrix of, like, income levels and showing how that works?
That would be an excellent next slide to create. I agree. We don't have that slide for you tonight. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was gonna say, part of the reason we don't have that information is because the state does not give us cross-tabulated data.
Correct.
So we know how black students are suspended and low-income students, but we cannot tell you what happens to a low-income black student with a disability. There is, however, legislation on Beacon Hill right now that would require the state to cross-tabulate that data so we could look at black girls and white girls and so on and so forth in a more thorough way.
What she said.
And one thing to add, most organizations that are doing this research also do not disaggregate the data in that way. So a lot of the work that I end up doing is reaching out to people and asking them to do that because they don't think about the intersections of how that has an impact and creates greater discrepancies for more marginalized folks.
Folks, we count what matters. We don't count what we don't think matters.
All right.
I don't know what you want to do. Yes, ma'am.
I'll project as well as I can. Under the IEPs for students with disabilities, if you have an intellectually disabled student or child, in their IEP, it should be identified that they do not fully comprehend the school discipline laws, okay? And it's supposed to be in that IEP, so they are not subjected to the tyranny that has been going on for too many years. It's just flat out. And if parents are not told about that, then they think that their student is supposed to go through the normal procedure of a code of conduct and discipline in the, like, regular ed students.
Right. There's a requirement legally of a manifestation determination to be made. And that often is never done. And in not doing it, children are penalized for behaviors that are not within their control. So I didn't catch a question in that, but I certainly agree with what you're saying.
When is it going to stop, is my question.
Well, I think that these kinds of dialogues that we're having here tonight are part of actually thinking about how to make things stop. Because we have to identify what is and isn't working. We have to put our time and efforts behind things that might work. And that's not an easy thing. It's not easy to figure out that issue. And we can't actually wait for our legislators to do that for us, because that's not actually what drives them. Sir.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I usually get the notice for this kind of lectures every time. This time I said, you know what, I used to come here almost every Thursday, every Wednesday. I said, no, I have to come and say something. I graduated from here way back. Sent my son here, he graduated from here. In 2015 with his bachelor's degree and master's degree in engineering, and he left and went to Yale. Now, the situation, the status quo has continued to be the same. We know what the problem is. was one of the lecturers who came here once, which showed that the average income, net income of the blacks in the city of Boston was $8. And I was asking that day, say, is it $8? You mean 8 or 800? No, $8. The average net income of the whites in the city of Boston is $208,000. Don't tell me, some people say, well, it's education. Now, if we say it's education, how many black people with PhDs or this and that are in management authority in any institution here? Tell me. If some people say, well, it's because of this and that, this is all excuses. The fact is that we are in deep trouble. It's very sad. I just drove one way from Natick to here because of this, because whether I like it or not, yes, I'm a part of it. And it cannot be subletted. You cannot sublet it to the city of Boston or to the Commonwealth. No, it's our problem, and we have to solve it. How do you
Thank
solve
you for being here and raising that for us, and I think that's actually a great segue into our panel, where we have a variety of folks that's actually talking about how they are trying to address these challenges within the city of Boston. So I'm going to ask for, we have a couple of folks from I Have a Future, IDL Polydor, and India Drayton, sorry. Could you both come up to take a seat? And we are also going to have Trucy Allah join us up. And Trucy is at the Suffolk County House of Corrections, working in re-entry and other work in that way. Susan will be joining as well. So before we even start asking any questions or hear from the panel, I'm just going to ask for you all to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about the work that you currently do, and I'll just pass it this way.
Okay. Thank you, Kamara and Dr. Rothstein, for having me. I'm Trucy Allah. I'm an assistant deputy superintendent. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you have to speak directly into it.
Is this one better? Maybe. Yeah. Okay. Once again, good evening. Thank you, Kamara and Dr. Rothstein, for having us. I'm Trucy Allah. I'm an assistant deputy superintendent at the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department. And in my current role, I'm overseeing the 18 to 25-year-old population. We just created a unit, and we call it the Peace Unit. Positive education always creates elevation is what the acronym stands for. It's heavy laden with programming. We have cognitive-based therapy programming. We have clinicians doing anger management. We have partner organizations such as ROCA coming in and partnering with our guys while they're on the inside, so there's a rapport built so that when they transition out, we're connecting them to education and employment opportunities. We have positive historical rates on the wall. Dr. King, the Obamas, Supreme Justice Sonia Sotomayor. We try to have reflections of everybody who's on a unit, which the unit is right now, the capacity is 30. We have room to grow it, unfortunately. And the statistics of the breakdown of the race are reflected on the unit. Out of 26, we had two guys that were Caucasian, 5 Latino, and the rest Black. So the data definitely is on point, but for me, I don't need the data to know that we have a problem to help fix it. But we're doing some great things, but unfortunately, this is a lot of our guys' first chance at life of getting things right, and they're already behind the 8 ball being incarcerated. Sheriff Tompkins is doing some great things with this Peace Unit, which came from, it's a model program that came out of Germany, and this So a lot of the crimes that the young men and women are committing are impulsive. It's because of peer pressure, addictive behaviors and lifestyles. So this unit, we all went through restorative justice training, security staff, civilian staff, and we have mentors that are actually, we call returning citizens, but for a setting like this, inmates, who all went through a training together. And the idea behind it is, if you treat an individual with loving care, you treat them like a family member, the chances when they get out, their success rate rises exponentially. And so that's the idea behind the program, and I'm glad to delve into it a little bit later. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Oh, that's loud. My name is Adiel Polidor. I'm one of the lead organizers at I Have a Future. I Have a Future is a youth organization based in Upham's Corner, but doing statewide work. We were formed in 2009 as the Youth Jobs Coalition in response to major budget cuts in the state budget for the Youth Works line item. So young people and adult allies got together, and then in 2015 we went through a strategic planning process and identified that young people in the state of Massachusetts, young people in Boston were impacted by far more than just youth employment. And that it was an opportunity for us to think strategically about how we could take on different kinds of campaigns. So we started organizing more around the juvenile justice system. Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about like who I Have a Future is and the work that we're up to a little later, but I'll pass it to India for now.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is India J.N. from I Have a Future. Also, just going into what Ariel was saying. But I Have a Future, like, yes, we was created in 2015. We have two major campaigns that focus on ending youth criminalization and getting full youth employment for the youth. So the things we have accomplished and the things we have like really stood out was minimum wage, raised age around youth jobs, and also in the youth criminalization we got expungement passed. So expungement is basically making sure 18 through your 21 birthday is not getting penalized for non-misdemeanor crimes. And also another accomplishment was making sure 7 to 11-year-olds is put into the juvenile justice system, and that is called raised age.
Hi, I'm still Susan Mays-Rothstein, and some of the other things that I do is that I have been on the Boston Public Schools Code of Conduct Advisory Council since 2010. I am a member of the Education Law Task Force. I have my own 501c3, so I know where I speak. When I talk about the mad dash for cash, it is called Our Restorative Justice. And I am partnering with the Center for Restorative Justice at Suffolk University, working on a National Institute of Justice, an American Institute of Research grant to bring restorative justice practices to 30 of the 125 Boston public schools with a whole school restorative justice model. Having been in practice and teaching for most of my career in the area of law, I am quite clear that our Western legal paradigm, which is conflated crime, punishment with the concept of justice, is in fact nothing but a road to injustice. And so the practices that are eons old, that we are now familiar with in the context of restorative justice, is a paradigm of justice that is about community healing and community voice and empowerment through community. I think that justice as healing, justice as repair, justice as making things as right as we can is actually the human understanding of justice. And our state-sponsored violence that we call the criminal justice system is nothing but state-sponsored violence in people's lives. So that's a little bit more about what I do, and I'm happy to talk about any of that further. I'm particularly delighted to talk about restorative justice to anybody who would like to talk about that.
So what are some of the ideological assumptions and beliefs, messages that are continuing to drive the inequities that are creating the criminalization of youth?
I just spoke to that, so.
So for me, is the stereotypes are like we're lazy, young people are lazy, they're worthless, they don't got no home training, but that is false because look at me now, I'm 19 and I go to Boston University, and without that income or without I have a future, I wouldn't be on this panel with y'all and sharing my personal experience, and I wouldn't be helping my mother every single day. I wouldn't do half of the things I wouldn't do half of the things that these stereotypes or these narratives put on.
So one thing I want to say quickly about our future. So part of the work that we do is that we do organizing with young people on campaigns. A little bit about our structure. So we're a staff team of 4. I'm the oldest staff person. I'm 25. And so really it's an organization for young people, led by young people. India mentioned she's a campaign manager, and then we work with mostly Boston Public School and Boston Charter School high school students who are between the ages of 14 and 18, training them as youth organizers, doing a lot of political education with them, and then going out and doing like lots of state house legislative meetings, doing actions and rallies and all of those things. And so really creating spaces for young people to be challenged, to be supported, and to take all of the experiences that we saw in those slides. Like sometimes I talk about the work that I do with my friends and they're like, oh, you must be like working with like the top students at BLS, and I'm like, no, that is not the reality. It's like really people who are directly impacted, who are being pushed out of schools, we're creating other spaces for people to learn and think about their context. And that's really exciting to me, so I just wanted to share that. But I think that the dominant narratives that exist, like India was talking about, they're dominant narratives that exist about people, young people of color, but there are also dominant narratives that exist around the systems that young people are interacting with. And so, you know, there's the dominant narratives around our criminal justice system. For example, a couple that I'll share. One, that jails rehabilitate. I grew up with that narrative, you know, bad people are in jail and they go to jail so that they don't make those mistakes and they can become better people. Like that's a really simple thing, but many of us might be living or working under the assumption. We might have like learned that or internalized that somewhere. So that's a narrative that exists. Another narrative that exists, that police keep us safe. I did not grow up with that narrative as a Black person, but many people do have that narrative. And so generally, if the police are doing something or saying that there's something that you should do or follow, then likely it's the right thing to do because they're safe, like, you know, they're safe people, they're gatekeepers, they like make sure that things are in order. That's a narrative that we work under, that many times our justice system works under. And then the last thing, I already mentioned this, but that jails are places for bad people, and also that the way that we avoid these systems and the way that we avoid this is by being good people, whatever that means. But being a good person in this country is largely very coded. It's being wealthy, it's being white, it's being male, it's being heterosexual. And so when you are not able, or you are not those things, your identities are criminalized. And so I think those dominant narratives, like, yes, there are dominant narratives that exist about young people, but I think there's also dominant narratives about the systems that young people are interacting with. And the way, I mean, part of the way that we challenge some of that is challenging those narratives about those systems as well. So not just like, how can we train police to interact with young Black people on the street better, but also like, how do we challenge our society to think about the ways that we are criminalizing young Black people based off of their simple identities.
Next question. I mean, you want me to add on to that?
I think since you work on the inside, it'd be interesting to also hear some of the internalized beliefs as a person who's also worked on the inside, and what folks who are within the system, how they feel and believe the system works for them.
So I'm in a different lane, obviously, but the unit where I am, that I oversee security and non-security staff alike. So I'm in charge of, making sure that the volunteers and the community-based organizations that come in are sound and solid and are really helping guys move the dial. So there's not a man in my housing unit that doesn't believe that they have a future when they get out. My unit coordinator, Val Harris, he, is a man of lived experience. And he, is old enough to be my father, but I'm his supervisor. So we have staff on the unit that have walked a mile or two in their moccasins. So they know that a future is possible. We're connecting them with community-based organizations that are not only pouring into them while they're inside, but also there to pick them up when they leave. So when the family that they don't have to go back to that sound is taking them to checking with probation, can making that first 24 to 48 hours a success, because when that doesn't happen, the recidivism rate rises, So they all believe that they're gonna do it, and yes, they have hiccups and they have setbacks, but I can tell you that the unit is unconventional to criminal justice. It's usually throw away the key, they're the bad guys, staff's the good guys. And so this unit is totally against all of that, right? They get a home cooked meal once a month. They have a program, they have folks coming in on a regular basis consistently. We're pouring into them, and we're treating them like we would treat each other. So the traditional folks don't like anybody on that unit, staff or inmates, because they don't understand, why are you being nice to someone that is an offender of the law? Because they're gonna be your neighbor tomorrow. And that's the bottom line. So what do you want them to do? You want them to come out worse, the same, or better? And we bought into making sure that they come out in a better situation. So I wish I could give you the gloom and doom, but I can't.
So I'd just like to add to that particular wonderful set of thoughts that we have made the stereotypes around Black and brown people since slavery. And the issue is the identification of who is deserving and who is undeserving. And so because of a physical identifier, we have decided that it is Black and brown people who are undeserving. We were fine with immigration when we were populating the country with white people through this Staten Island. Now we are no longer fine because we are against the idea of brown people populating our country further. Crime is an idea. It's a set of that, we have first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter. All of those designations we have in the law for only one purpose, for the purpose of meting out punishment and how much punishment a person is going to get. So when you created a system of winners and losers, deserving and undeserving, that, friends, is what supports our capitalist society, so that we can have people who have an unequal distribution of wealth and power in our society. It all works out for us who are not living in the underserved parts of our country, but it is actually what is undergirding and supporting what we do and why we do what we do, calling it, labeling it justice, when it is not.
So what are some ways that you've partnered with other groups who are trying to dismantle or think about justice as you are redefining it here?
I feel like I talk too much. A partner with as many of our professional organizations in law as possible that are interested in working on dismantling the cradle to prison pipeline. Work with schools, work with youth groups, and very interested in working ever more deeply with the community. In fact, what we would like to do is bring restorative justice practices to community, because communities have held restorative justice practices as a means of maintaining community for eons. So, however, that's a space that is not, has no natural funding streams. So schools, which are communities nested within communities, they have funds, if they're willing to spend them, in the direction of changing what they do from an internal perspective, so they can contract for support to be brought in. However, communities live in this, because of our public services and our governmental agencies and our social services, communities do not have a natural funding stream for bringing change to them. And so what we would like to do in partnering is to partner with organizations to bring in a multi-year foundational grant to try to build something within community that will allow communities to develop restorative justice practices. We'd like to be able to step away a little bit from the mad dash for cash and actually move in the direction of empowering communities.
The question was, what are ways that you are partnering with other groups or organizations to continue to dismantle or redefine justice as you are defining it?
Thank you. Okay, so ways that I have future personally goes about it is just piggyback on what you said, just coordinating with other organizations, just teaching them what we have learned, and then also they teaching us as well. Just going to different schools, making sure everyone's aware about this, especially young people. Others is like foster care and also homeless shelters, because like so many youth are like homeless, and we just want to bring that into the light. And like foster care, because like I was a foster child, and like how I overcame that, and how my mentors showed me I have a future, so that's how I personally got involved.
Yeah, I think for us, we have been doing a lot of work to push specific policy. So I think like all of the things that I shared before, I stand by them, they're true. And just acknowledging that like ideology shapes institutions, but as an organization, as a small organization, like there's certain things that we can do to shape ideology, and that is a much larger project. And so there's specific things that we're doing to shape policy, and that's where we're really doing a lot of that like collaborative work with different groups. And so I mentioned this earlier, we do a lot of work at the State House. Our organization was funded, not funded, but is funded, but was founded as a coalition of a bunch of different youth organizations across the state. And we still have all of those partnerships, so there's over 20 youth groups, many of whom you might know. Some of them are neighborhood groups here in Boston, like St. Stephen's Youth Programs, the Chelsea Collaborative, Dorchester Bay, the City School, Center for Teen Empowerment, Mission Safe. Those are some of our organizational partners, and we work with them, do trainings like India said, but also do a lot of like specific policy work. And so a couple of the things that we've been working on, I mentioned, and India mentioned expungement and the Raise the Age bill, but also doing a lot of advocacy around youth jobs, and just acknowledging the way that youth employment is one of the things that can support and interrupt the cycles that we've been talking about. And I think that there's an effort for us to connect more with people in our neighborhood, so we do a lot of door knocking and just like talking to people about the issues and about the work that we're doing, and making sure that we have like a neighborhood presence in Upham's Corner. And tomorrow night, actually, we're hosting a community night talking about the intersections of music and social justice, and that's just really for like community members who are totally impacted by the issue but may not be in a space like this today, to be able to have those conversations with us. And I think that like, I think that as far as the relationships go, we acknowledge that there's more that we want to do to build more partnerships. So we've tried to do work with DYS in the past, and like DYS involved youth, and like that's sometimes been successful, sometimes challenging, and doing more work with organizations that have reach where we don't have it. And so like trying to expand more and connect more with groups in Western Mass, so like the state doesn't end after Worcester, but like really just connecting more with young people in different parts of the state as well.
I'd say that the most consistent partner that I've been working with recently has been Roca Boston, and they work with a lot of at-risk or proven-risk youth. They've been a main staple in this new housing unit that I'm overseeing. Also, the mayor of Boston has an office of returning citizens. So anyone being released from either DYS, the House of Correction, the Department of Correction, can go to the Office of Returning Citizens, 22 Dry Dock Avenue, and you can get services relative to someone transitioning from inside to out. A couple notable organizations that help the work that we do would be Union of Minority Neighborhoods, Horace Small, Louis Finfer with Mass Community Actions Network. Fighting on the Hill, trying to change legislation. All of those things give the guys that I serve and motivate, inspire, and sell hope to every day, more hope when they see laws being changed and legislative, processes helping inspire, their loved ones along the way. Boston Health Net Plan also deserves a shout out because they host forums like this. And Lead Boston, where's Catherine? There she is. So Lead Boston is an excellent leadership, social justice organization where I met Catherine in 2009, 2010. That really expanded my breast and talked about everything from race, religion, sexual identity, everything you talk about at your dinner table, about the people you talk about, were in this group. And it helped change time like this, I would say I grew up Catholic, I adopted Islam, and I visited Israel. So can we just all get along?
With that, I'd like to open it up for any questions for the panel.
Hi, this is for I Have a Future. So I'm the director of a program on campus that mentors girls in grades 3 through 5 on female empowerment and feminism. And it's really awesome. And most of the girls we work with are Black and brown. So they're just at this age now where they're beginning to recognize when they're treated differently than their white peers. And you guys mentioned that you work with youth and you go to schools and talk about what you do. I'm wondering if there's a way, or if you have any like tips and tricks for how to discuss these issues with really young kids, A, and B, in particular for girls of color, if there's any kind of like toolbox for them to ever recognize when they're being victimized by this system when they're so young. Because I had one girl yesterday said that she like got in trouble for wearing braids at school, which is like ACLU level. I was so mad, but I didn't know how to like. I talked to her about it, but she didn't quite get it. It was just above her head a little bit. So just like any like how do you talk to youth about this, I guess.
So we use the popular education model, and the basis of that is like, well, Paulo Freire, Brazilian educator, writer, but that everyone can learn. I so firmly believe this to be true, that everyone can learn and everyone has something to contribute, and that like, especially if you are living at these intersections, like this is yours. And there's a lot of jargon and a lot of fancy language that we use to like intellectualize and talk about these things, but like 5th grader, like that's, her life, that's their life, and they're so smart and they should be able to hold that too. And so I found popular education as a really helpful tool, thinking creatively about how you're conveying information. And we really draw on the School of Unity and Liberation. They're a training institute based in Oakland, California, and they train youth organizers. And so all of their content is like breaking down capitalism and US imperialism and all of these things, but not like aimed at like, a master's student, really aimed at like how do you break it down for a 13, 14-year-old. And so as like trainers, we've been like trained in how to do that. And so when we think about like how we're conveying that information, it's always using that tool. Like how are we engaging our bodies? How are we moving? How are we like thinking creatively in this space? And I found that to be really helpful. And then to your second point about the toolbox, I don't know, but that sounds great. I would love for that to exist.
Thanks.
Yeah. There is a student rights app that BSAC has worked on. Yeah.
That's an app on the Code of Conduct for the Boston Public Schools that is available through BSAC. But I did want to add also that we often talk about teaching kids, but actually children have a tremendous amount of wisdom. We don't talk about wisdom in learning. Wisdom is actually extraordinarily powerful. And as something that is a shared knowledge, it's a lived knowledge that creates wisdom. Children have wisdom, so children can keep circle just as adults keep circle in restorative justice practices, right? So what they need in order to do that is a question that they can hold a circle with. And those questions come if you're telling your truth from your heart, you can come up with a question that is powerful. So I think that there's a lot that we do that we try to say children are too young or they don't understand or not knowledgeable enough. If you get to the issue of wisdom, you don't have to worry about that anymore.
Hi, Adia. Yeah, hey there. I wanted to know if any of the folks you had worked with had any engagement with the workforce system in Massachusetts, so if they had ever been to a career center or engaged in programming promoted by a career center. I work for the state and help manage that network, and I wanted to know what feedback they might have.
Cool. Yes. So are you talking about like school to career, like that line item, like that funding?
So YouthWorks definitely.
Okay.
Something that, yeah.
Great. Many young people who work with us are funded through like BCYF, through the city of Boston, so like youth work's filtering down, and so they have the experience of engaging with that. But there are probably young people who also have the experience of like connecting through someone who's placed in their school and navigating that way. And so I would be happy to connect more like individually about that. Like if there's specific people that you want to talk to and get their feedback directly, but would that be helpful? I just feel a little weird being like, so this is what these people said. But I would be happy to put you in touch with them directly.
That would be great.
Okay, cool.
Okay, I have one more question. What if we define the solution to all this and then say charity begins at home? By this I mean, this is unique in United States of America, which is very, very, disappointing, given the fact that we are the light of the whole world. My question is this: do any person think here that if we define how our, public policy works by saying no more Framingham High School, no more Wesley High School, no more Crosby High School will be high school and funded by the federal government, and it's not a function of where you live and zip code. As long as we are in this merry-go-round, we will be back to the origin, and our origin now becomes an arbitrary origin, which is, instead of at the ground zero, we begin at jail. What do we do when they do this? We kind of welcome them back in the society. When this is created by environment, man is a man in a society. Man outside a society is a beast of God. When we have a stratified sample of a population like this, so if you step into neighborhood where it doesn't look like you, we'll talk about the police, brutality, whatever they call it. In most cases, it's not brutality, it's just the people are afraid. We are where we are today because we have no roots. Nothing. There's no dynamics. We're not Americans. In fact, some people are marginalized and quarantined, as un-American, simply because of the function of color. What happens if the Commonwealth Constitution try to change it? They can change it overnight.
So can I try to rephrase the question? I guess what could an ideal shift be that would help to ultimately dismantle the challenge? So, the example given that the stratification of zip codes actually helps to add to the challenge. What are some bigger, broader initiatives that are, maybe things that we may not even, if funding was not an issue, what would help?
Yeah, I'll take a stab. So I think a couple things have to happen simultaneously. So the programming that I'm a part of has to happen, locally and statewide, right? Because 99% of those that are behind the wall coming back. So we have to do those programmings, and we got to make those institutions like the Peace Unit, which is that's a hard sell. But more important, and equally more important, or more important than that, is getting into the school system at the grammar, before high school, like before the passing of the baton of bad and deviant behavior begins, right? There needs to be programming and a prevention model going into the schools. We have clinicians already going into the schools, right? We have street workers that are already working with at-risk and gang-involved youth. The kids that we're talking about that are in school that are on the fringe have friends and family members that are full-fledged gang members that are in their neighborhoods. So their struggle to go to school safely to and from is a big deal. Their public safety. And then the peer pressure of them avoiding going in the wrong direction is another real issue. So I think getting into the school system before they get to high school and having these healthy conversations before intervention is needed is the way to go. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We have to prevent it from starting. We gotta prevent them from even getting on the track. And you do that in the first, second, and third grade, like early. Because fourth, fifth, that's when they can project how many prisons they need based on the truant system. That's a fact. So the way you put I put myself out of business is we get into the schools before they even get on the track. But simultaneously, you have to have the programming happening while they're already, those that have already crossed the line. So that's an easy fix, I would say, but that's what I would suggest.
But excuse me, I have something to add to that. The problem again is that we are a stratified society. There's no homogeneity. There's no way you can't bring apple and oranges at the end of the equation or at the middle of the game and say rock and roll. It doesn't work. The system has to be integrated. The system has to be blind, colorblind. It has to be, and by saying that, what I mean is that if we create, just think of what would happen. If we created if we had turned, this train that has run away, away and then create a society nearby, just like I did. Whether you're in kindergarten or this, you go to school, the convent of mass will, stratify it and put people everywhere. Make sure they get there, make sure they go home. Kids will mix together, whether they come from the affluent and the most privileged or the meeting. Then you realize that there are people who have nothing to eat.
So I think what you're talking about is a change of mindset. What we need is a change of mindset. And it is unlikely that while what you're saying is exactly true, that there will ever be enough funding to do it. And the reason is that there is not a mindset that is what we need to do. And so I think every effort is an important effort. I do think that for systemic change to actually take place, it requires that we change our mindset, which means we need to understand justice in a different way. And that's why I have moved in the direction that I have after so many years of law.
I had a question about, we were talking about the number of students of color that are being suspended all the time. And you're saying that the schools aren't following suit. Are they talking about in-school suspensions instead of sending kids out into the city in the middle of the day? Or it could even be talking about maybe the students aren't feeling challenged enough. There are so many students that are being, diagnoses are being thrown at them when they're just not being challenged enough. Are we talking about how to fix that within the school system so we don't have as many suspensions?
Such a complex question. The challenges that the schools face, and so we collect data. Like we had a whole group here who were very interested in data, all of the data in the school system data is an honor system. So when you create systems, people game them. People play the systems, right? So when we are talking about school exclusions and reporting school exclusions and what are the nature of the school exclusions, we have a wonderful member of Greater Boston Legal Services who has been doing work and actually sued the Boston public school system for these very practices of, just outrageous exclusions from school, unreported exclusions from school, and has a memo that she shared with the Education Law Task Force, which represents 40 organizations, about the 10 different ways that the Boston public school system has been able to exclude children from school and not have to report that they're excluding children from school. So, it's a mess. That's a mess, right? The Boston public schools, one of the most challenging things that I found about working with the Boston Public Schools is that literally everybody and their relatives would like to fix the Boston Public Schools. And so therefore, the Boston Public Schools get all kinds of foundation money, all kinds of grant money. All of that money comes with strings attached and with programs attached and with requirements attached. And the Boston Public Schools just takes all the money. And so what happens is, all of those things are, in fact, panned as the next best thing since sliced bread. And the Boston Public Schools has 100 of them at a time. And therefore they commit to 0 of them. And in committing to 0 of them, the staff, the line working staff, which are the teachers who are on the front lines, are in a constant state of oppression because they have to do the next best thing since sliced bread. So what happens is they do not commit to that either, and they just wait for it to blow over. Meanwhile, the children in the Boston Public Schools are not getting an education. So that's some of the challenge of this school exclusion picture.
I realize that based on the charts that you've shown that the charter school numbers are higher, whether it's suspension, in-school suspension based on color or other issues. Do you think that fixing the pipeline probably begins with fixing the charter school, and how could we go about that in terms of policies?
So the charter school systems, like the Boston school systems, has an interesting reverse incentive program, right? So the whole concept of charter schools is it's a laboratory of innovation, educational innovation, and every one of those laboratories wants to say that they have figured it out, that they know how to do the best education. And that incentive is, look at our numbers. Look at how many kids we're sending to these next higher education yada yadas. Which means you gotta get rid of all of those that would mess up your numbers. That's the incentive for the school exclusions in the charter schools, unfortunately.
I'd like to follow up on what you said about early prevention. So for the last 15 years, I've served on the board of the Social Impact Center in Roxbury, which is trying to address initially the problem of shootings in Roxbury and the fact that we were basically losing somebody every week. And we started backing up to say, well, how did the kids get to that point? And we backed it up to their, the predominant reason was they were not staying in school. So we took it from there and said, well, let's work with the elementary school. So we adopted the Higgins School, the Dearborn School, and said, now let's back up from there. Now, why are they getting thrown out of school for minor offenses? And what we found is part of it was family, part of it was poverty, part of it is the peer group that's around them and the people that will grab them if they come out of the system. And we've been focusing on how do we keep people in the system. Expelling is the last thing we should do, but we can't rely on the teachers that when we have this behavioral issue, for whatever causes it, how do we deal with that so that the gangs never get their hands on them? And you see the result of that when we don't do that.
Correct.
So we need to make an investment somehow to support the teachers to say we've got to keep these kids in the system. We can't let them out. We just can't. That can't be the reward.
He's spot on. We package that up and sell that to the city of Boston. What I would say, add to that would be, we have to, and don't, it's not about black and white. I know when you hear black and white, it's polarizing to many of us on both sides of the dial. What I would say is though, with respect to that, you have to have a healthy, robust, unapologetically Black history curriculum. And what I mean by that is, when you see people like you that have accomplished great things, it inspires you to want to be that. And that's why in the peace unit, I have pictures of Black greats on the wall. Amilcar Cabral, Bisu Kampo, Toussaint Overture. Like, unapologetically, I'm not apologizing for that because I know that everybody that connects to that heritage is inspired by the fact that I thought that much of them. And they want to be that, you know? And so, hurt people. If I don't like me, then you don't stand a chance. And that's what you see in the criminal justice system. It's a bunch of folks that have been hurt. And because we keep moving the goalposts, they get frustrated. When they get frustrated, you revert back to what you know how to do best. And that's make a mess. But if you inspire them through schools to, before they even get on that path to greatness, then even if they fall short, they're still going to be a successful individual. So to my man's passion in the back, and I love it, right? You should be up here. But the solution is the knowledge of self and Black history, unapologetically, system-wide, statewide. It has to happen.
Question about the Black history.
We have a hand here.
I would love to know, so I think some of the changes that were proposed are really focused on trying to change youth. And I would be interested in hearing from the I Have a Future folks about changes that the systems can make, because I think our changes that are focused on trying to change young people are misplaced, right? Like, we created this problem, so I think that, like, districts could just not suspend kids at all. That would fix it. We could just not arrest huge categories of folks. We could give poor people money and so on. So I'd be really interested to hear like what thoughts you have about what systems could do.
Great question. So for me personally, me personally, I have to say the school system and also the jail, because schools, like, it goes back to your point, like the curriculum, and like when I was in high school, like I didn't get the necessary textbooks because like my teachers didn't think I needed it, but I was a senior, so how come? But anyways, it's schools and how the curriculum need to be switched around so it fits all, and how we should create after-school programs for higher level, not just the low grades, and and also how we should like incorporate after schools, but also tell them, okay, 101, you're worthy, you have a voice. All these positivity things that to inspire them pursue their career, and also inspire them to just be them, because like that is like really low, because believe it or not, like I didn't like have faith in myself like 2 years ago, but I have faith in myself, and I tell myself in the mirror, I'm beautiful, I'm powerful, and I'm independent. So I think if other youth hear that, or other high schoolers hear that, I think it was like a good step in a direction. And then also the jail system, just rehabilitation, and also making sure they get the support they need when they come out of jail, so they don't go back to jail. So because like we're trying to break that cycle, not make that cycle keep going on and on again. So that's what I think. Did I answer your question?
It absolutely did.
Good job. Yeah, I think both of those are really spot on. We've been doing some work with the district attorney's office. So last year, we did a lot of work around the DA's race, and did a lot of like youth peer education on like what is a DA, and like what is the role of the district attorney. And we held a forum, and the candidates running for DA attended the forum. It was like the only youth-led forum in the county. And part of the commitment that candidates made was that they would meet with us twice a year as like youth advisors to think about how they could make sure that they're doing things on their end. And so that's like something exciting, I think, for us as we think about like not just youth, but like what are some of the systems that can change. And so I'm really excited to think about like the role that the DA's office can play, and how we think about sentencing, and how we think about the way that young people through the system and challenge some of those things as well. So yeah, that's one example in addition to what India shared.
Elizabeth, I'm going to answer the question too. So I think that what part of my enthusiasm for finding a way to bring restorative justice practices to community is that governmental organizations, agencies, state operators, etc., need to start thinking of themselves as community members instead of power over, that they actually are accountable to. And so if in restorative justice practices people are inviting power holders into circle, for example, and then everyone who's in circle is actually equal, then the accountability starts to flip. So that in fact, what we have is a coercion system that includes much too much power over people's lives, unduly so, simply because of a hoarding of resources. So, those resources need to be addressed and they need to be held accountable in ways that they currently are not. And I think that only community can hold those kinds of systems accountable. So that's my thought.
I have lots of thoughts. So one of the things that I'll share is that I am a Boston Public School alum. I went to 8 different Boston Public Schools, kindergarten through 12th grade. Can't tell you how many times I was suspended, but lots of times. I also have done programming at the Suffolk County House of Corrections for women. So I did not offer all of that before, but I do think that in terms of thinking and understanding what the system is and how it has an impact on young people and where they end up as adults and the work and passion that they may have. I think it, as a young person who was suspended pretty frequently for what you were talking about, being bored, it wasn't until I had a principal, a Black female principal, that said, let's just take her out of class and have her do something different. And so I was brought into art classrooms. I built the sets for our plays when other students were still doing additional learning because it was clear that I understood what I needed to understand already. And so I think there's also other creative solutions that are out there and really thinking about what are the specific needs for the individuals to really get at how to help them to find their own self-worth and find their own trajectory. I think the biggest challenge is that we have a lot of adults that think they know and don't really listen. And so if, in fact, we begin to listen to what young people are saying, you find out they actually know what their needs are. They can tell you, by and large, exactly how to address their needs. But we are insistent on getting into a power struggle because we're adults and we know what you really need. And so I'd encourage us to begin to think a little bit differently about what and how we are actively listening to the youth that we have around us who are crying out and saying, stop, listen, and make change. So I just felt I had to say something like that. Any other questions?
There's one in the back.
This is tough when you have a high percentage of single-parent households and their offspring, their children have learned behaviors and characteristics of
before we start talking about poor parenting skills or judging folks on their parenting needs, it completely died on me. Dear battery! Sorry. Can you hear me now? I think it's come up a number of times to think specifically about poverty and what's the root cause. And so parents have to make a lot of choices for their children because they do not have access to resources in their own needs. And so to make a judgment statement about what is the right or wrong way to parent it's an arbitrary measure of what we may say our different values are, and we do not have shared values around that. And that's okay, but I would encourage us to think a little differently about what parenting needs are and how people's needs are being met prior to making a statement around whether or not it is truly the parenting that is at the root of this challenge.
I would suggest that we need to stop incarcerating the men that live in the communities that are unable to be helping with the parenting. That would be a good start. We're so much in the business of desiccating communities of color by taking out people from those communities that it is extraordinarily hard to raise the children. Then the parents who are left have to work multiple jobs. So, you know, we're not actually, we need to hold the system accountable for what is going on in the communities. We have a command and control system that is about coercion. And in that coercion, we are busily taking from those communities the human resources that could build the communities. That, to me, is the much bigger question, much more important question than how is a struggling parent parenting.
Thank you.
Thank you.